This is Just Something About Her, a podcast from the Recount and iHeartRadio.
Women to this day are the majority of the population, the majority of the electorate, and the majority of the workforce. But we don't talk about women that way. We talk about women like they're some sort of special interest group,
right? Which
is ridiculous.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Palmieri. On this podcast, I talk to powerful women about how they made it to the top on their own terms. This week's guest, Errin Haines. Errin Haines, welcome to Just Something About Her.
Thanks, Jen. So happy to be here.
Super happy to have you. This is the anniversary of the 19th.
Yeah, we just hit our 1 year anniversary.
Yeah. Tell us about the theory of why it was created, what kind of work that you all are aiming to do.
You know, the 19th, it's crazy to think that we've already been in the world for a year, and yet it also feels to me that we are just part of the ecosystem now in terms of how we talk about politics and who and where we are as a country. But, it wasn't always this way, as you know, and frankly, my frustration over how things have been for so long was, and the frustration on the part of our other co-founders was a big part of why we exist now. Mm-hmm. My now CEO, Emily Ramshaw, was at the Texas Tribune. The 2016 election happens, and it's like, well, okay, we thought we'd hit this historic milestone with Hillary Clinton as our Democratic nominee, and yet, we found out that the country was not ready for a woman president, or maybe just not that woman president, right? Yeah. And so my boss thinks, well, somebody should have a news site that focuses on women in politics. And then she went on to have a baby and live her life. Yeah. And, life goes on. And 4 years later, I'm back on the campaign trail covering the most diverse, presidential primary that we'd ever seen. 6 women standing for president. You got people, of color running for president. And yet, the same narratives around race and gender were persisting. And it was so frustrating for me, even as I was in my dream job. I was formerly the race reporter for the Associated Press, national race writer on race in America. The job that I wanted since I was an intern. And yet, I was looking at political journalism teams in newsrooms across this country that were still way too white, way too male. And so how was the narrative going to be different if both the gatekeepers and the storytellers really had not changed dramatically, right? I mean, certainly there were more women covering politics, more people of color covering politics, but overwhelmingly it was still really kind of the same makeup in too many of the places where we get our news and information and trust people to tell us about what politics is and who matters.
What does that look like when you said that the same narratives around gender and race were persisting? Does it reveal itself in a lack of coverage? Does it reveal itself in horse race coverage, non-substantive? What would you say is different now, when the 19th is covering things?
The short answer is yes. It is all of those things, right?
All those things, yeah.
Also, yeah, I mean, so at the 19th, horse race political journalism is not what we are interested in. We are interested in stories that center voters, right? The people who are being directly impacted and participating in this democracy, and people who, are off the coast, but also in just even thinking about who gets to be defined as a voter, what kind of voter. Nobody really is a single issue voter, right? You've got, who are we talking about though when we talk about rural voters, when we talk about educated voters, when we talk about blue collar workers, we talk about faith voters, right? Really dispelling those kind of archetypes and stereotypes and hearing from people who care about a range of issues around a range of and a range of perspectives. So the premise of our newsroom, we're named for the 19th Amendment, obviously gave some women, not all women, the right to vote when it was ratified over 100 years ago. And women to this day are the majority of the population, the majority of the electorate, and the majority of the workforce. But we don't talk about women that way. We talk about women like they're some sort of special interest group, right? Which is ridiculous. Right. And so, for our money, all issues are women's issues, right? So we are going to talk to them. And also, marginalized folks we know are becoming, an increasing part of our population and an increasing part of our electorate. It's not that they don't care about these same issues. They are engaged. Nobody's asking them necessarily, about, again, everything, not just the thing that, people may assume is only concerning to their group.
And so the 19th, it's named for the 19th Amendment, in which some women, white women, won the right to vote.
Right.
But you were the co-founder who came up with the idea of putting an asterisk behind the T.
Thank you for asking me about this, Jim, because I do love talking about the asterisk. When we were conceiving this newsroom and kind of conceiving the name of it and the mission and the vision for it, the 19th Amendment was something that was very, very powerful symbol for a lot of us. But at the same time, as a Black woman who knows the history of this amendment, I certainly understood that naming this newsroom that, especially with what we wanted to do in terms of changing the conversation, not just around gender, but also around race and politics, was that we had to talk about.
And you formed it last year, which was in the you formed it in the middle of the...
heading into the centennial of suffrage, but also coinciding with this national reckoning around race, right? And really around institutions and systemic inequality, right? So like all of that just made the asterisk that much more powerful to me. And that asterisk is in recognition of the omission of the Black women who frankly were thrown under the bus by the white women who, were fighting for the right to vote. But there were Black suffragists that stood shoulder to shoulder with them who were sacrificed. You've still got Black women on the front lines, fighting for their very fragile access to the franchise, even as we speak, right? But you had, many white women, once they got their access to the franchise, they abandoned that fight. They no longer saw the need to continue to be suffragists because they got what they wanted. And so they don't necessarily see this as their fight anymore. And I think you have women of color who are back on the front lines, or some of whom never left the front lines, who are saying, hello, like, we need you in a way that you weren't there for us 100 years ago. Please show up for us now, because this is something that, affects, that if it affects any women, it should affect all women, and everybody should care about this issue. And I think a lot of white women, frankly, last year saw themselves being harmed by that system, especially in the pandemic. Seeing, the workplace disparities, seeing, the economic disparity, seeing that they actually were vulnerable and fragile in a lot of those ways, and recognizing, that a lot of these systems that they thought maybe could protect them actually they could also be harmed by them too. Yes, you would hope that we're kind of all in this together, but the idea that there's an understanding that they are also impacted by this, and so that they should also literally have skin in the game, I think was that was kind of the beginning of something where you are starting to see some solidarity around more issues than traditionally we have seen, and that is what kind of made last summer feel like maybe the start of a tipping point. As a Black woman, I wrote about race, thought about race as a person, as a journalist, for pretty much my whole life, my whole career. It wasn't until I came here that I really had the freedom to think about what it means to be a woman in this country.
So you formed the newsroom last summer.
Yeah.
This is your first anniversary. Tell us about that.
After 2016, I knew that there were too many newsrooms that did not get right what happened with that election. Right. And I knew that I didn't want to wake up after the election in 2020. I wanted to be able to wake up and say that we did get it right, that we did tell the story that needed to be told about this election and about who and where we were as a country in that moment, right? And I knew going into 2020 that race and gender were not just a story of the 2020 election, they were the story. Mm-hmm. And if people were not going to say that as, collectively, not just me as the race writer at the AP, but the whole politics team needed to be writing stories playing to those themes, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing about coming to the 19th, it's not that I wasn't going to, I was writing the stories that I probably was going to write for this election, right? But I was writing them as the main dish, not the side dish, if that makes sense.
Right. Yes.
Right. They were the story. They were not, and by the way, let's have this sidebar that talks about a race angle or a gender angle. It's no, the whole damn thing is about this. And if people don't understand that, then no. One of the hardest adjustments for me coming to the 19th as somebody who, as a Black woman, I wrote about race, thought about race as a person, as a journalist, for pretty much my whole life, my whole career. It wasn't until I came here that I really had the freedom, honestly, to think about what it means to be a woman in this country. Right. And how being a woman like how that is political, the ways in which that shows up in our politics and our decisions around politics. And what I realized is, this is why people associate feminism with white women, because if you don't have to think about your race as something that holds you back, you think about the other thing that you
think
feel
about the other thing that holds you back,
which is your gender. And I really didn't realize that. But even now, I mean, thinking about being a woman, like that intersection of race and gender is still very much present for me, and that is the lens through which I see so much of the work that I do.
You run into this notion of, well, if all of you women are going to go and create your own newsroom where you're only hiring women and you're talking about women's issues, you are no longer objective journalists. How do you, when people say like, oh, but you're only focusing on women, you're only hiring women, and but like, how do you respond to those critics?
First of all, objectivity is a myth in journalism, and it is easy to be objective when the default setting is white and male. Like that is not real. That is who decided, that there was going to be objectivity in journalism, and what that usually means is that we are, we are here to tell the truth, and if the truth makes people uncomfortable, I mean, that is a core tenet of journalism, is to afflict the comfortable, right? We are here to right wrongs. We are here to speak truth to power. We are here as journalists to leave behind the most honest and accurate record of what happened. And if we are both siding everything, we are not necessarily doing that. And in fact, we may be leaving a less honest and accurate record behind when we attempt to do that just for the sake of what? Of giving people equal time. Like that's not the point of journalism.
And did you always want to be a journalist?
No, I mean, it wasn't until I got to college and I had to pick a major, and it was like,
where'd you go to college?
Nosy. I went to Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. Okay. And I'm nosy. So that was
you
one
are definitely
thing.
nosy.
Definitely. Mom, I would say curious, but my mom would, if you ask her, she's going to tell you I'm nosy. And, but I like learning about different things and meeting new people all the time. And so journalism seemed like something that I could do that didn't feel like work. So, I tried it. There was a small black paper in Atlanta that needed reporters, and I walked in the door one day and said, "Hey, I could use some exposure here." And they were like, "Can you start today?" And I was like, "Great." And that was really, it was the Atlanta Daily World was the name of the paper, and it was a formative. Exist? It does still exist. Okay. But it was formative for me because it's one of the oldest papers in the black press in this country. And the stories that we told were about the black community in its totality, right? So not just, stories about black folks in crisis or trauma, but, black people leading, black people who had businesses, families, writing about people who look like me, and also just understanding that those people were worth writing about, that they belonged on the front page of that newspaper, and that there were black people in positions of authority that we needed to hold accountable. And so like that experience I carried with me throughout my career. I went on to work at the Orlando Sentinel, at the Los Angeles Times, at the Washington Post. I did a couple of tours at the AP in my hometown, and then also in Philly, where I now live, which I am obsessed with.
And then one day, as I understand it, you got a call from the attorney, Benjamin Crump, who told you the name of a woman that's come to be very important in our society. Tell us about that whole experience.
When I started my journalism career, and I knew that I wanted to write about race, I thought that at that time, this is me in my early 20s, I'm thinking I'm going to be writing about the legacy of the civil rights movement, the gains that those folks had kind of fought for, like the fruits of their labor, and also the kind of the last vestiges of racism. As
because you thought that was the path that we were on. You thought this is
where
mostly
we were
resolved.
As a society. Yes. And so I thought I was going to be writing about that. Most of the latter part of my career, I have been writing about the resurgence and the retrenchment of racism, and about the losses of that progress, which is something that has been very disheartening and very discouraging in a lot of ways as a black person, as an American, but a very fascinating time for me as a journalist. Sure. And, a big part of that has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was kind of how I came to meet Attorney Crump, who I've worked with since the Trayvon Martin case in 2012. Benjamin Crump is, he is the attorney that shows up when so
George
many of
Floyd's
these
family.
tragedies happen. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we get to last spring, there's a pandemic raging. And, so he is not the person that I expect to get a call from. And yet here he is calling me and telling me the story of this young woman, 26-year-old Black woman, paramedic, so, first responder in the pandemic, who is gunned down in her apartment in the middle of the night. And her name was Breonna Taylor. George Floyd hadn't yet happened, but Ahmaud Arbery, who had happened in my home state of Georgia, he had just been killed, and people were there were hashtags for him, and people were very upset about what had happened to him in this pandemic, and yet there was hardly any national coverage about what had happened to this young woman. And this immediately resonated with me. I mean, at the 19th, I didn't think I was going to be writing about Black Lives Matter very much anymore, because most of the people who are killed are Black men, unfortunately. But here you have this Black woman whose case was no less egregious, and yet, why was she getting less attention? Well, I mean, gender is part of that, and you have to be honest about that. And so when he came to me, it was a no-brainer to me that this was a story for the 19th, that we were going to put her story on the national radar, hopefully get her story trending, and hopefully let the world know what had happened to her, because it was horrific. It was more than a tragedy. It seemed unjust, and it seemed like something that people needed to know about. I do think it resonated more because we were saying that it mattered, and that we were this new newsroom that was really setting priorities and putting a stake in the ground and saying, no, like this is a thing that we care about, and this is a thing that we think that you should care about too. How do you remove the obstacles to get folks back to the workplace, and so that they can participate in this democracy, in this society? Everybody has to be asked about this. It is not just on women to figure this out.
Okay, so you talk about telling issues through the lens of gender, right? And so, I know that your 19th motto that all issues are women's issues, and that's important because some brands of feminism only focus on issues that affect white women because they've the obstacle in our way has been our gender, not our gender and race. So it's like gender, wage gap, reproductive rights. You forget some of the most pressing issue that women face are evictions, right?
Yes.
Voter restrictions, poor healthcare.
Exactly.
So I want to talk give some examples of like what it does mean to look at these issues through the lens of gender. One example I know is the Portraits of a Pandemic that you all did. Tell us about that. What it taught you about the most important issues women are facing at this moment.
Thank you for bringing that up, Jim, because Portraits of a Pandemic was really rewarding work for me personally last year. What we realized as a newsroom was women were absolutely at the center of this pandemic, that the pandemic was political, and that we needed to focus on how this thing was impacting women as part of our, that was our political journalism at that point, right? And so Philadelphia has had the distinction for a while of being one of the poorest big cities in America. And I thought, well, what if we could tell stories one woman at a time, one issue at a time, in the poorest big city in America about the inequality that was already existing before the pandemic, but that was absolutely being exacerbated by the pandemic. And so that's what I did. So let's talk to the people that are being impacted by policy, right? Let's talk to the woman who is worried about how she's going to make the rent because she's out of work, and the landlord is not being helpful. Or let's talk to the teacher who is scared to death of what's happening with her students who she's lost touch with in the pandemic because there is a digital divide in Philadelphia, and even getting them Wi-Fi is meaningless if they don't even have the laptop to connect to the Wi-Fi, right? Let's talk to the small business owner woman who is not only trying to keep her business afloat, but is also trying to keep employees, so that they have a way to make a living and to eat and live and function in this pandemic. So like every week, I just got to hear from just really extraordinary women, extraordinary in just the ordinariness of their daily life that they were navigating, and really hadn't had a chance to even take a breath to think about how this pandemic was impacting them. And so to be able to ask them, how are you doing, and how are you doing this under these circumstances? Yep. It was remarkable.
And how about, so a year later, do you feel like a lot of those issues, child care, elder care, leave, that those things have fallen by the wayside? I mean,
yes.
We're talking a lot about infrastructure. We're talking a lot about Afghanistan right
No
now.
less urgent for the women in this country and for the marginalized people in this country who have been enduring this, for the past year and a half, if not before, right? Mm-hmm. But in terms of our governing, yes. I mean, you see these infrastructure bills moving through Congress. Things like caregiving, things like the minimum wage increase are things that are falling by the wayside as these negotiations go on. Well, maybe we don't need this right now. Maybe this isn't a must-have. Well, it is a must-have for a lot of the women who frankly voted for this administration and who voted for people who they wanted, who told them that they were going to push for these things, once they got elected. And so I think that is why you are continuing to see activists and the folks that they mobilize continue to call for action on this, because they know that we are at a moment, where, people are aware of this now. And so let's turn that awareness into action. You do see women saying, we are not going back to the way that things were before. And they are in a position to say that and to try to make those changes in their own communities and their own lives and demanding that of their government.
And have you seen that in the women that you talk to when you're reporting? Is that there's just like a switch has been flipped, and they're just not willing to make the same sort of compromises that they were prior to the pandemic?
Absolutely. They're trying to, I mean, for women who had to drop out of the workforce, thinking about what it's going to take for them to be able to go back to the workforce, whether they want to go back to the workforce, and seeking out employers that are mindful of these things, definitely is what we're hearing, or just hearing them articulate them. These are things that we need, or this is not going to happen. And I think again that we have to keep asking men how they also plan to be part of this solution, whether that is the men who are running these businesses, whether that is men who are elected officials who could make a difference if they would, talk about why this is important, not just for women, but for our society, right?
Yep.
And for the men that control a lot of these businesses where women and marginalized folks are going to be working, like, how do you remove the obstacles to get folks back to the workplace and so that they can participate in this democracy, in this society? Like everybody has to be asked about this. It is not just on women to figure this out. I mean, even when I, hear things like a Marshall Plan for moms, it's like, nope, parents need to be the ones that are asked about this. Like, because what that implies is that the burden is still on women to figure this out and to deal with this.
So, but there was something to celebrate last week, which is Vice President Harris convened a group of business leaders to discuss child care and these right.
And that has been a big part of her portfolio. I mean, you see, in looking, because I definitely have thought about her at the 6-month mark as well, and her lived experience and how that is playing into her leadership and how she is approaching policy. I think that you have seen that show up in her response to the pandemic, and also in these conversations around infrastructure. She has brought women to the table.
The human infrastructure,
the caregiving piece to the table, and she's not letting that drop off of the conversation.
And what are you finding at the 19th in terms of the issues that she's working on that that show that the work is also different because a Black woman is doing it?
Voting rights is a big one, because you have so many of the activists around voting rights are Black women, and Black women wanted to see a Black woman as vice president, wanted Joe Biden to nominate a Black woman. So much of what I heard from them last year on the campaign trail was, that they were looking for a return on their investment being their vote and their mobilization of other people to vote, because Black women never vote on their own. They take their community, their sorority, their church, their whatever institution they are a part of, like network they are a part of, like that. They're taking all those people to the polls,
take this
right?
with them. Yes.
And so, for them though, it's not just about elections. It is also very much about governing. It was not just about getting rid of Donald Trump. It was about issues that they felt were very existential, frankly.
Yeah. And based on the conversations you have had with women, Errin, what is the one policy that would that would make the biggest difference? Like, just based off of what you've seen has happening in women's lives.
I mean, the child care piece is huge. It is.
Yeah. I just think it keeps coming back to that.
If as a society we do not figure out caregiving, if we do not stop just making it the purview and the responsibility of women to figure this out on their own, we don't move forward as a society. And things will not be better for women in the workplace, especially. But I think just in their lives, generally speaking, things don't improve if that is not addressed going forward.
And thanks for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me. Please, are you kidding?
My God, so good.
I've been waiting to be on here, so here I am.